Hello, Goodland Church. Hope that you're having a great week. Happy Advent. Thought it was appropriate that I sit next to my Christmas tree this week as we continue on our series looking at the meaning of Christmas through the stories captured for us in the Gospels. And if you were with us last week, you know that we started by unpacking the meaning of Christmas through the lens of the Magi. And we are going to continue this week and then the following 2 weeks looking at Christmas through the lens of some of the people that are captured throughout the gospel narratives that are not Jesus and Mary and Joseph, but people who are kind of peripheral characters, and asking what did it mean to them that Jesus came, in order to then ask what does it mean for us. So last week I said we looked at the Magi in Luke chapter 2, and I mentioned that this week we would carry on that same passage, looking at Christmas through the lens of King Herod, or Herod the Great. And I think Herod's story is a bit of a cautionary tale for us, but I would like for us to dive in to try to understand how Herod might have experienced Jesus' birth as a way to encourage and to challenge us when we seek, especially in these days, to find the meaning of Christmas. So before we dive in, I know it's not a surprise to any of you who've been around for a while how much I love Ted Lasso. And Ted Lasso, if you've been under a rock and you don't know what that is, it is a show on Apple TV, and it depicts a guy who is an American college football coach. And he's hired because the one who hires him wants to tank a European soccer team or football team. And so he comes kind of as the American bubbling idiot that doesn't know anything about World Cup soccer, World Cup football, and he doesn't know terminology, he doesn't know the players, he doesn't know the rules, he just doesn't seem to get it. But what you find quickly in the show is that Ted has a way of endearing himself to everyone around him and to those of us who are watching. And in the story of Ted Lasso, there is a character that shows up in the very first episode as a peripheral character and is drawn into the center of the story. And this guy's name is Nathan. And Nathan is a guy who lacks in self-confidence, and he is the equipment manager for the team. And Ted notices him, calls him out, knows him by name, draws him out of his shell, and really listens to what he has to say. And so throughout the story of those first two seasons of Ted Lasso, Nathan's character gets developed more and more. And throughout, you see that Nathan is desirous of credit and attention. So there's a storyline that goes that Nathan comes up with this play and they use it on the field to much success. And Nathan wants the credit for that. He wants everyone to know that it was his contribution. Meanwhile, he is still not a coach and not person who that's his job. And Ted has offered to draw him into the center. So Ted is gracious and welcoming and warm and invites this guy into the circle of trusted advisors. He becomes a coach. And you see throughout, especially the second season, that Nathan is increasingly hungry for power, hungry for recognition, hungry for what he sees as his right to be seen as the great coach that he is. And I tell you this story, I'm not going to tell you the end of season 2, but I tell you this story because I think Nathan's story in many ways parallels King Herod's story, and perhaps parallels our stories, in that we want to succeed. We want to be recognized. We desire and long for someone to notice our accomplishments and achievements. I don't know anybody who just wants to not be noticed and not be thanked and not be appreciated for their contributions and not be told that they're great. I think we all have that in us. We desire, we long for someone to recognize our greatness. And Herod, we jump into the story of Herod's life without much context and background. And so I'm going to give us some of that context today so that we might be able to step into the story as Herod would have experienced it. So we're going to go back, first of all, to Matthew chapter 2 and look at the story of the Magi. But again, this time we've talked about the Magi, we talked about how they would have experienced Christmas. Now we're going to talk about Herod in this story specifically. So Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. All right. So a few things are happening here, and I think it would be helpful for us to have a little bit of context on who Herod was and a little bit more of his story. So we don't find this in the scriptures themselves, but in extra biblical writings, in Josephus, for instance, who is a contemporary of the Gospels, wrote lots about the history and culture of Judea, of Jerusalem, of Israel. He wrote about King Herod and other writings as well, but it's confirmed here. And something to know about Herod was that in his 20s, he became kind of the darling of Rome, all right? He became the guy that Rome really, really liked. And the way he did that is that he had a role in Galilee collecting taxes or overseeing the collection of taxes. And he made Galilee the cash cow for Rome. He was so efficient and so effective at requiring and collecting these taxes that Rome paid attention to him. Now, interesting to know about Herod, he was actually a Jew. So he would have come from a Jewish family, a Jewish faith. So by his association with Rome, he put up walls and barriers, social, political, relational barriers from his own people. And he put stock in the fact that he was going to rise to power. And in fact, he did. So Mark Antony, who a character throughout the Roman Empire you can read about in your history books, actually appointed Herod to be the tetrarch. And in that process, he became tetrarch, but there was a coup that tried to overthrow him. And because Herod didn't have a lot of friends on the inside, he appealed to Rome. He went to Rome and said, "You've got to help me to defeat my enemy." And so Rome backed him because they loved him. He was their darling, and gave him the power to overthrow the one who was trying to take him out by force. This guy, the one who was opposing Herod, was named Antigonus. And Antigonus, by Herod's own hand and own initiative, was put to death for this treason act. Now, Herod had a way of having strong suspicions, very severe suspicions, for anybody who would oppose him. He was hungry for power. He wanted to rise to the highest level. And so anyone who might have come in his way, in his path, and questioned him or would have been a competition to his power, he used every one of his tools, everything in his tool belt, in order to do away with them. He worked tirelessly to impress people. He feared the loss of power. He destroyed all his potential rivals. And it wasn't just in this area. He actually was known for being ruthless. And he also knew that the Jews didn't like him. He was appointed the king of the Jews on behalf of Rome, but he was never, ever accepted by the Jews as their king. And this drove him crazy because all he wanted to do was live as the king, to ascend to the highest power and authority, and to have everybody bowing down to him. Now, he wasn't all bad. One of the reasons why Rome loved him so much, not only his campaigns to bring in money for the government, but he built a lot of infrastructure. He actually rebuilt the temple that was destroyed, the Temple of Solomon that was destroyed. It was his job and his initiative that he took in order to rebuild that temple. And it, in its greatness, is because of Herod the Great. He had great initiatives. He took lots of painstaking efforts in order to make the people of Israel like him, and yet they never accepted him as their king. You know, he feared conspiracy from within, and he used his power to eliminate all threats with violence. He even executed his own wife because he suspected that she was plotting against him. He had 3 sons, another wife, and a mother-in-law who he also had killed because he suspected that they were forming a conspiracy against him. He, as we see in Matthew chapter 2, he oversaw the slaughter of innocent babies because of this proclamation of Jesus the King coming. So one of the most interesting stories that's told about Herod, and we find this in other writings outside of the Bible, was that he apparently told his sister that when he died from all that we can tell historically, he died from a terrible form of cancer that was painful and debilitating and degenerative. And so he knew at some point he was going to die. So what he did, because he could not earn or win the approval and affection of the Israelites and the Jews, instead what he did is he used his power to create a necessary worship of him. So out of fear, the people revered him because he rounded up the most prominent men in the Jewish community, and he had them put in prison. And nearing his death, so the story goes, Herod told his sister that upon his death, he wanted them all to be slaughtered because, he said, because if no one would be mourning for his death, at least the people would be mourning at his death. That, my friends, is a picture of someone who is self-absorbed, hungry for power, needs, shall I say, this attention and affirmation. And so, with that picture in mind, we have this story that unfolds, and Luke, it's not accidental that Luke captures this story and contrasts it from the Magi and the King of the Jews. Because what do they say? Do you remember? Let's look back at the text. So, Jesus was born, and Herod was king. We want to make sure that that is known. King Herod was in charge. And here come these magi from the east. They're looking, the question, we talked about this last week, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Not who will become King of the Jews, whose heredity lines him up to potentially inherit the throne, but where is the one who has been born? Just by his birth, he is king. Do you see how those words, from Herod's perspective, would be very alarming? He would be suspicious. Remember, he's already suspicious. He's already somebody who thinks everyone's got, they're conspiring against him. And he gets word that there is a baby that has been born king of the Jews. And so what does he do? He tries to use his power to get what he wants. This is a pattern for his life. So he says to these men, first of all, he finds out where would this baby be? And then he called the Magi and he said to them, go and search carefully for the child. And as soon as you find him, report to me. And what does he say? So that, this is verse 8, so that I too may go and worship him. Because the Magi have made it clear that they recognize by the signs and the stars and the compelling draw of God, they know that this is not a baby unlike any other baby. This is a baby unlike any other baby. This is the baby that will be king, that is king by birth. And so they come to worship him. And what does King Herod say? He says, I too want to worship him. Remember that picture we talked about last week? That there's this recognition of the true identity of the one that they bow down to. Herod is deceiving them by his intentions. He has no intention of worshiping this Jesus. He has every intention from his story, we can tell, of eliminating any possible threat. That's what he does. In fact, we read about that in Luke's gospel, right? We see that in Luke 1 and 2, that's exactly what he does. He goes and massacres innocent children because he's trying to eliminate the threat. Now, God had another way, right? We know the story from last week and this week, that he warns these Magi in a dream, and they never go back to Herod. All right, so imagine yourself in Herod's shoes. You get the news that there is one who has been born King of the Jews. Then you bring together those who are learned and knowing, and you ask them about the prophecy. You have them remind you about what has been foretold, and they confirm that there indeed is a promise that there will be one who will come as king. And suddenly you realize that you're not the only show in town. In fact, the picture here in the scripture is really stark. You have King Herod against King Jesus. And I've said this before, that we can think about Jesus and Advent and the coming in Christmas as a story about God coming near to his people and relationally restoring us. We can think about it on many different levels. We talked about last week how it's a cosmic story that's happening and unfolding in these pages, but it's also a story about a kingdom. In fact, we talked about this before, but the entirety of the scriptures can be viewed from a lens of the kingdom. And here, the gospel writers are reminding us that the kingdom is coming in Christ, and therefore all competing kingdoms, whether kingdoms of men or spiritual kingdoms and authorities, will be vanquished, will be done away, will be put aside for the kingdom that is coming in Christ. You see, the coming of Jesus meant that a new king was in town. Why is that significant? Because the people of this time, much different than how we live today, lived under the ebbs and flows of whoever was in charge. You know, we have some of that a little bit with our political system, who our leaders are and how they represent us. But in the day of Jesus, in the time that we're reading here, they were utterly dependent upon who was on the throne for their very well-being and their method of living their lives. They were to submit to a kingdom or face consequences. And what's so interesting about the story of Jesus is that we have pitted right against the birth of the King of Kings. We have a guy, Herod the Great, who is a self-proclaimed king of the Jews. And yet He's forcing people to live under his reign and his rule. He's forcing people to live under his authority. They have no choice. They must submit to him, or, as you see, be put to prison, be killed, whatever. And by contrast, we see this Jesus coming in, inaugurating his kingdom as the rightful king, who doesn't force his kingdom on anyone. He doesn't require or force anyone to submit to him. He doesn't make it so that there's no other option but to succumb to his power. But instead, he comes as a humble king. You see, you have a king like Herod who he will sacrifice anything and everything in order to get ahead, in order to bring him glory, in order to make his name greater. He will do anything and everything to win the respect of those who are important for him to win, those in power. And by contrast, we have this Jesus, this King of Kings, who submitted to his earthly body and life on earth, coming down from his throne in glory, and surrendered himself. King Herod surrendered anyone and everyone. He sacrificed people for the sake of his name. And Jesus ultimately will sacrifice himself, and the Father will sacrifice his Son in order that we might live. We might have life. So here's the thing. For Herod, the announcement of Jesus and his kingdom coming and his birth was bad news, because it called into question everything that he had worked for. In fact, his whole life was summed up in that title. And in fact, by Jesus' coming, it turned everything upside down. He was no longer the rightful king. He was no longer, or at least his time was short. And so for him, Jesus being born, he missed an opportunity to enter into a better kingdom because he was so set on living as king of his own kingdom. You know, I was reading something recently from the Pope, and the Pope was talking about how it doesn't do any of us any good to just talk about Jesus coming as a baby and not as a king. Because if we talk about him coming as a baby, though important part of our story, that he was lowly and meek and humble, the greatness is not seen until we realize that that humble baby was actually rightfully king, and that in order for us to faithfully respond to Jesus' coming, we have to both recognize the beauty and humility of his coming, but we also have to recognize the true identity of the one who's humble, the true identity of the one who sacrifices himself for us, that he is king, but came for you and for me in humility and gentleness and meekness and vulnerability. That he put on flesh and entered into our world, not so that he could grab more power and build his kingdom. We talked a little bit about that last week. But so that you and I could enter into the kingdom that he reigns over and rules over. So here's the thing. In a kingdom, there's only one king. And in our faith life, there can only be one king. If you and I are seeking for our own glory, if our attention and our time and our efforts are spilled, are poured out, are utilized in order that we might have more credit, we might have a better name, we might get ahead, we might rise in influence and power, then we, my friends, are building a kingdom of our own. And the story of Jesus and the story of Christmas is that we surrender our kingdoms to submit to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Herod couldn't do it. He could not submit himself to the kingdom of Jesus because he was too committed to the kingdom of Herod. So I wonder, how have you been seeking to create and build your own kingdom? Friends, Herod's kingdom was fragile. It was fragile to the point where he had to murder and capture and threaten people in order to maintain his power. And maybe you're not murdering or threatening or capturing people, but maybe your kingdom, you're realizing how fragile it is, because if somebody else is getting ahead, that means you're not. And so they're a threat to you. They're a threat to your happiness. They're a threat to your success. They're a threat to your building up of yourself. And that's a Herod mentality. That's living in the world as if we have to. It's our only choice, but to maintain a position of authority and power by force. And it's grasping at straws. So friends, let's look at Christmas differently this year. Let's look at King Jesus differently. Let's see his coming as an invitation to put away the kingdoms we build, to put aside the name we're trying to make for ourselves, put aside the efforts and the longings and all of the things that we're doing to get ahead. And Lord, and let the Lord shape our lives. Because here's the thing. The King of Kings, Jesus, is a good king. And we see that contrast here in the passage as well. King Herod was a not good king, right? The Jews didn't like him. Nobody liked him except for Rome, because he made himself their darling. And they loved him for it. But you see, with the King of Kings and his kingdom, he is a good king who's doing what is best for you and for me. And so he invites us, not by force or by show of power, to submit to him, but invites us to come under his glorious kingdom, come under the goodness that he has to offer, come under the grace that he has given us. Because in Jesus, through Jesus, you and I are given life and given it to the fullest. So will you lay down your kingdom and submit to Jesus as King?